Year 10 and 11, welcome to your analysis of Scrooge in preparation for your English literature exam. If we begin with his name then, we have obviously his surname and his forename. So we've got Ebenezer Scrooge. Ebenezer is a noun and it is a male given name and is from a Hebrew word meaning stone of help. Scrooge is obviously also a noun, and that means a selfish person who is unwilling to give or spend, and or a miserly person. Now, some people suggest that this name was chosen to show the help that he receives from the ghosts. So remember, stone of help. If you are analysing in more depth and judiciously, as the examiner puts in their mark scheme, then stone of help is even more important, because in the opening stave, Scrooge is described as hard and sharp and somebody cold, and that reminds us of a stone. So in this instance, stone of help, we've got a twofold. We've got the fact that he is helped by the ghosts to change, but also this idea of stone. Scrooge now we know means a selfish person. You know, today in modern culture, you say to someone, stop being a Scrooge, if they're being selfish or greedy or not spending their money. But if we go back to older English, Scrooge was an obscure English verb meaning squeeze or press. And again, that's not an accident by Charles Dickens. It's implying that Scrooge in the opening was someone who would squeeze every last penny out of people, who would press them to work harder. For instance, we know how he treats Bob Cratchit at the beginning, how he has treated other people, particularly the poor. So his name does hold metaphorical connotations. I'll start off basically and then I'll go more in depth with Scrooge. So basically he's the protagonist. At the beginning of the novella, he's presented as miserable and lonely, someone who only cares for money and for making money. He treats Bob Cratchit badly, making him work in the cold and making him fear for his own job. He tells the charity workers that poor people should die rather than be given charity. He is the antagonist to his nephew, so that Dickens sets up contrasts within their two characters, and I suppose that heightens how awful Scrooge is at the beginning. We know that he's visited by the ghost of Jacob Marley, who tells him that focusing on his money is wrong. He's then visited by the three ghosts. They show him Christmas days from the past, and that is when he begins to realise that he has been making bad decisions throughout his life. He seems to enjoy the present Christmas at the Cratchit's house and Fred's house. He learns that if his behaviour continues, Tiny Tim will die and no one will care about him. And finally, he does change his behaviour. More in depth. Scrooge is used to represent the rich in the Victorian era, in the Victorian era, and to highlight the gap between the rich and the poor. If you need to watch my context video, please do so, which explains the background of the book and the time that Dickens was writing in, which is vitally important. He also symbolises the theme of repenting. Dickens uses Scrooge's character to criticise society. Scrooge is a symbol of the wealthy and aristocratic members of society who are ignorant to the misfortunes of the poor. Basically, they don't realise how poor the poor are and how difficult their lives are. And context, very briefly, again, please watch the video. It's set in Victorian London. Now, Dickens was poor and his parents spent time in the workhouses. He wanted to make Scrooge disliked at the beginning and liked at the end, to encourage the upper class to be more generous. Okay? So therefore, Dickens uses Scrooge to encourage a moral change in the wealthy members of society, and this makes Scrooge part of the allegory, the bigger allegory at play. Just to revert back up to the workhouses, remember at the beginning when the charity workers are asking for money for the poor, Scrooge's character yes, he says they should die, or he says they should go to prison, or there's workhouses for them. And Dickens himself had first-hand experience of the workhouses. So please watch the video on context, because it does feed a lot of what Dickens is writing. At the very beginning then, we have a miserly and mean character who only cares about money. Quotation: squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. So Dickens' use of verbs here presents Scrooge as a penny pincher, as someone greedy. And remember, that is, as I said, synonymous with his name. If you want, again, to be a little bit more analytical, you can take out individual words. Grasping suggests that he's clinging on to something. And the irony here being, it's something he doesn't need because he's already rich. And scraping and clutching also do the same thing there, as if he's grabbing onto something that he so desperately needs. If you are someone that has a bad memory and knows perhaps they can't remember long quotations, then we might just do the simple one, tight-fisted. And that adjective, as we said, refers to the fact that he was greedy with his money, doesn't like to share. I suppose to a certain degree it highlights the ignorance of the rich. He's portrayed as unfeeling, with Dickens repeatedly referring to the cold. I'm going to go on to pathetic fallacy in a minute, so please hang around. So we get a frosty rime on his head and on his eyebrow and his wiry chin. Look at that metaphor. The idea that the frost is actually stuck to him. He is so cold of a human being that the frost sticks to him. He's cold in terms of his response to other people. He's also cold in terms of emotion. He doesn't feel sympathy for the poor. He doesn't feel sympathy or apathy when people want to have Christmas as a holiday. Another quotation: he carried his own low temperature always about with him. Again, to a certain extent, that's metaphorical in the idea that it's as if Dickens is saying that he has his own temperature that he himself carries. Now, if we look at that, and this is where we're going to get really more focused, he carried his own temperature as if it's a burden. Now, at the end of the novella, and I'm skipping here, he says when he's changed that he feels lighter. And this is a direct contrast here, because the burden of carrying this low temperature, this coldness, this horrible exterior, is contrasted at the end when he says, I feel lighter, as if the burden is gone. I'll go into that when we get there. Another quotation: the cold within him froze his old features. Again, look at, so on the exterior, this frost is stuck to him, and now inside his interior is also frozen, and it's so cold that it freezes his facial features. So again, it's this metaphorical idea that this man is cold inside and out, emotionally, physically, spiritually, if you like. Cold is linked to him from the very beginning of the novella in stave 1, and it shows his cold nature, the fact he's emotionless. Again, the fact that I'm talking about the exterior and the interior is going to link to one of our most important similes, which I'm coming up to, which is the oyster. We've got external heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm, no wintry weather chill him. Now look at that line. You've got alliteration, you've got or sibilance, whichever technique you can write about in a more detailed way. But look, the warmth could warm, no wintry weather chill him. Look at the W's here. It almost prolongs this sense of unease, and this unease that we feel in the presence of him, the unease that other characters feel when he's walking up the street in stave 1 and nobody wants to speak to him. A repetition of no. It's very absolute. He can't be warmed. He can't even be chilled because he's that cold. And then it carries on to no wind that blew was bitterer than he. Again, repetition of no. If you want to be very analytical, you've got your plosive B sound in blue and bitterer, which again is harsh. It sounds harsh. Dickens is fully utilising figurative language and language devices to present this hard man, this harsh man, this man that is to be disliked. Pathetic fallacy then. As I've just mentioned previously, the pathetic fallacy is used to represent his character and also the change. So in stave 1, we are told on numerous occasions about the cold and the dark. For instance, we've got foggier yet and colder, piercing, searching, biting cold. Now, as I mentioned just a moment ago, this represents how cold and unfeeling Scrooge is at the beginning. But when we get to the end, the weather is clear, bright, jovial, with golden sunlight. The change in weather represents how Scrooge becomes generous, glowing, and a good person. So please refer to the pathetic fallacy. There's endless examples in stave 1 about the cold and the dark. And again, it is setting up this mood, and it is a metaphorical representation of Scrooge. Also, at the beginning, he is presented as a lonely man. Initially, we get secret, self-contained, and solitary as an oyster. We've got two things at play here. We've got your simile and your sibilance. Secret, self-contained, solitary as an oyster. So perhaps, if you picture an oyster, perhaps underneath he does have a more delicate and fragile nature. The sibilance makes him sound like a harsh man. Much like when you open an oyster, there is more to his character than meets the eye. The oyster is in a hard shell, but contains a pearl. This is an image we can link to Scrooge at the end of the novella. Perhaps the pearl was in fact his heart. This is a huge simile for us in terms of the character of Scrooge, because it's showing us actually that this hard, harsh exterior and this coldness that he carries around is just a shell. It can be removed, and when it is removed, we find this generous man, this good man. Hard and sharp as flint is another simile we get, and it presents his hard exterior. Now, if something is hard and if something is sharp, it will cause you pain. So it's this simile is the idea that he is causing pain to other people, namely the poor. Okay, so Dickens is cleverly pointing out here and criticising society through his use of language devices. Okay. Another quotation we might remember, but it's a long one, so let's be realistic here. Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole administrator, his sole assign, his sole residuary, legatee, his sole friend and sole mourner. Now, if you remember the single word soul and talk about how it's repeated, that's good. That's very good. If you can remember some of that line, that's brilliant. Whatever's best in terms of your memory. Now, the repetition of soul here, you might even just remember his sole friend, his sole mourner. That's pretty simple. The repetition of soul shows the solitary life that he leads. The fact that there's nobody around to help him, and because nobody wants to be his friend. It's almost as if nobody wants to work with him because of the greed and the way he has lived his life. So one word quotation soul, one word quotation tight-fisted. We've got our simile of the oyster. We've got our simile of hard and sharp. Now he reacts to the charity and to a couple of people with bar humbug, one of his famous sayings. Again, we should be looking at that from an analytical standpoint. Now, humbug is something designed to deceive and mislead. A willfully false, deceptive or insincere person, an attitude or spirit of pretense and deception. Now, again, in terms of interpretation, it's entirely up to you. There's perhaps two things at play here. Either Scrooge reacts to people like that because he thinks they are deceptive and misleading and insincere. Okay, which is why he perhaps says that. Or in fact, he could be seeing that because he himself is an insincere person. That there would work as an analysis, but remember, it's got to be what you think and how you interpret him. Okay, we'll carry on. As I said, he tells the charity workers that poor people should die. Now, that is a huge line in terms of a critique of society, and it absolutely emphasises the gap between the rich and the poor, doesn't it? If they would rather die, they better do it. I've put your ellipsis there just to shorten the quotation. Scrooge is now being presented as being misanthropic, disliking other people, disliking society, being antisocial, almost reclusive. Okay? And as I said earlier, he also says that there's prisons and workhouses for the poor, as though poor people should be mistreated in that way. Now, Marley's ghost starts the transformation of Scrooge. He asks for sympathy from the ghost. Jacob, tell me more. Speak comfort to me, Jacob. Now look at that. Speak comfort to me. It's almost an imperative. It's Scrooge begging. Now, we have this subtle change already. He's begging the ghost, and the ghost's response is simple. I have none to give. As in, I've got no sympathy for you. I can't help you. So this is your first instance of Scrooge beginning to change, and it is when Marley appears. Now, we also get Marley's ghost bothered him exceedingly. Now look at your adverb, exceedingly. It really does highlight the beginnings of a subtle change. Oh, apologies, I've made a typing error there. I've put subtly change instead of subtle. I do apologise. So the adverb exceedingly highlights a subtle change within him because he's bothered. Look at that word. Okay, so we have the beginnings of the change in Scrooge. The ghost of Christmas past then. We are shown that Scrooge has had a bad past. He tried to forget what might have contributed to his cold nature. When he goes back and sees the past, it says he had an unusual catching in his voice. Showing that now Scrooge is remembering his childhood, he is beginning to feel emotions again. And we get the adjective unusual. Why is it unusual? Because in stave 1, we have a description of a man who doesn't care, an emotionless, cold, hard, harsh man. And now when he sees his past and witnesses his past, he begins to feel something, and it is something unusual. So if you can remember the one-word quotation, unusual. Next, your lip is trembling, said the ghost. Again, look at your adjective, trembling. Not only is there an emotional change within Scrooge, but there's a physical there is a physical change. So we know that the transformation is beginning to really take heed and really transform his character, because it's not just his emotions that are changing here. It is physically, he is moved. Physically, he is traumatized by what he witnesses. And this goes further, because when he is shown his younger self, we get a lonely boy. Scrooge sat and wept, a solitary child, neglected by his friends. Sorry, that's another typing error. I do apologise, this is terrible. Neglected by his friends, I should say. So again, the lonely man from stave 1, when the ghost of past is here, reiterates the loneliness of Scrooge. In fact, it's lasted all his life because he was a lonely child, right? So again, for simple quotations, we've got lonely and solitary and also neglected. This awful imagery that Dickens is using, the lonely boy that was neglected by his friends. And this is going to shape the character that he becomes. And look, when Scrooge sees it, we've got this idea that he's overcome. Okay. When he views Fezziwig, Scrooge acted like a man out of his wits. Again, I suppose that does link back to trembling, because it's the physical change with him, a man out of his wits. It's almost like he's lost control. And then when he views the older version of himself, we get this description: greedy, restless motion in his eyes. Look at your simple one-word adjective, greedy. Greedy does link us back to tight-fisted, to the clutching, squeezing, wrenching man from the beginning. And I suppose as well as that, we've got restless, because as I said earlier, it's almost as if there's nothing inside of this man, no feeling. And actually Scrooge says himself, I cannot bear it. So this is only the first ghost, and he is already changing. And, you know, I can't bear it. He actually can't stand to witness what he witnesses, this lonely child and this past that has actually shaped his future. If we move to present, please don't forget to pause the video wherever you need. I have a tendency to talk quick. When the ghost of Christmas present arrives, Scrooge protests a little bit and he says, I learned a lesson which is working now. So that's a huge line for us. Again, I learned a lesson which is working now. So he admittedly says, well, I've learned something actually. Now, he also says to the ghost, tonight, if you have aught to teach me, let me profit by it. Now, again, Dickens has been very interesting with his use of language here. The word profit, we normally refer to money with this, don't we? Now, there's interesting use of the word profit here because it does not refer to money anymore. So Scrooge is not talking about profiting via money and financially, but he is talking about profiting in terms of his person, his character, his attitude, his behaviour, and that is huge. So please try and remember that if you can, because this is only the Ghost of Christmas Present, and he hasn't shown him anything yet. So that word profit is used very interestingly by Dickens, again, to highlight that money is where Scrooge has gone wrong and he can profit as an individual. Fred's house, then we get, he begged like a boy to stay. Another simile. It is highlighting his vulnerability. It reminds us of the oyster simile, that inside this guy is vulnerable. Scrooge has been reduced to a boy. He's fragile. He's fragile in the face of himself. He's looking at himself. He's looking at his life. He's looking at the people that he affects, and begged like a boy. Again, look at your plosive B there. It's very powerful. To stay. He actually has quite, he enjoys Fezziwig and Fred's house, doesn't he? Now, on viewing the Cratchits, we get this. Scrooge with an interest he had never felt before. Tell me if Tiny Tim will live. Now, again, your close analysis. Look at the subordinate clause with an interest he had never felt before. Now, being a subordinate clause, it is isolated within the middle of the sentence. With an interest he had never felt before. It is there, it is emphasised by Dickens, because he's showing us, well, he's never paid any interest to this family before, or to Tiny Tim. Now, again, your subordinate clause shows us the change in Scrooge. He is now interested in Tiny Tim's welfare. Say he will be spared follows that up. It's as if he's begging, oh my God, please let him be all right. Kind of reminds us of beg like a boy to stay, and the begging of Marley when he says, speak to me, yeah? After the ghost repeats Scrooge's words about the population, we get Scrooge was overcome with penitence and grief. Penitence, abstract noun, is a theme he in fact symbolises, isn't it? This idea of repenting. Now, the ghost says Scrooge's words back to him about the population, and what Scrooge had said in Stave 1 was about the surplus population getting rid of the poor because he thinks they're almost a nuisance. And when he hears what he himself has said, he is overcome with penitence and grief. Okay? So again, huge changes within Scrooge's character. And the future then. So we know at the end of the book, when the ghost of the future's there, Scrooge is dead, isn't he? Now it's the aftermath of his death. And people are discussing his death. And what we get is this. It's likely to be a cheap funeral. I don't know of anybody to go to it. Very, very sad, powerful line. Interesting use of the adjective cheap. For a man so greedy, for a man so rich, his funeral is going to be cheap because nobody's going to go. Nobody's going to want to go. Nobody's probably going to even arrange it properly. Okay? I don't know of anybody to go to it. Powerful line which emphasises the solitary life he has led. Okay? When describing him, the people describe him a wicked old screw. Look at your adjective wicked. Wicked is something that is linked more historically, I suppose, and more religiously to the Bible. And, well, not to the Bible, but more so to the devil. I apologise. So the adjective wicked is linked to the devil, isn't it? And that is a huge description or a huge presentation of his character, and that is going to contrast with the angel that is used as a simile at the very end. So bear that in mind. If somebody is wicked as well, they are evil, they are nasty, they are malicious. So the greedy man before is now wicked, and that I suppose takes on a darker tone. Gasping out his last there alone by himself. So he dies alone. Look at that adjective, alone again. It kind of sums up his entire character, doesn't it, really? And the fact that he dies alone is extremely sad. Scrooge listened to the dialogue in horror. Look at your abstract noun, horror. Now, He is terrified about who he is and who he could become. So remember, all the way through, as Scrooge is changing, we initially had him begging Marley not to haunt him and things like that. We then get the subtle emotional change that he witnesses. We get him confessing that he's learned a lesson. We get the trembling and the begging. But now we've got horror. And horror, I suppose, is more extreme, isn't it? He is horrified at himself. And then he actually says, I shall not leave its lesson. He, again, by admission, is saying, I'm not going to forget this lesson, which I suppose echoes the words he said earlier. I have learned a lesson which is working now. The only emotion that the ghost can show him caused by the event was one of pleasure. So when Scrooge says, show me someone who feels grief that this man is dead, the ghost can't show him a single person. What he does show him is just everybody laughing. Everybody is laughing at the fact that this man is dead. Everybody is pleased. Look at that word, pleasure. And pleasure here contrasts with the horror he feels. So where society and the environment in which he's lived, they're all pleased, he himself is horrified. And again, this is your contrast, isn't it? This is your critique on society. When he witnesses his grave, he says, I am not this man, and he claims that he's not. And then he makes this confession of, I will honour Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all the year. So again, Scrooge has, I suppose, if you like, has gone 360 in terms of his change. And when we get the end, he wakes up and we get the adjective glowing, so glowing. Now, the adjective glowing is a direct contrast to the description in stave 1, where it's dark and he's miserly and he's miserable and he's cold. Now he's glowing. Glowing has positive connotations of something uplifting, of something warm, of something that draws you to it. He had been sobbing violently. Again, adverb violently. Violently here, this adverb shows us that it has taken this experience to change him. It has taken this supernatural occurrence of the ghosts leading him down this path to change him. And he said so violently, again, is this idea that he's traumatized and overcome. Now, Scrooge is a lot more emotional and charitable. We can see this as he uses more affectionate terms such as my dear and my love. And he also laments that he can make amends. Okay? He, don't forget, offers to buy the turkey, and he's a lot more merry, isn't he? And we get, I am as light as a feather, I am as happy as an angel, I am as merry as a schoolboy, I am as giddy as a drunken man. Now, there's a barrage of similes here by Dickens. Now, the first one I did revert to earlier. When it said in stave 1 that he carries his own low temperature, it's a contrast here, very subtly, but it is, to I am as light as a feather. Because the low coldness he carries at the beginning is gone. It's as if the burden of his former self, the person